My name is Sarah and I'm a licensed architect here in California. In this video, we're going to cover a very high-level roadmap and checklist to determine your project's building size in terms of area, height, and stories in less than 10 steps. We'll reference the CBC, but you can also reference the IBC. There are many ways to conduct a code analysis and almost always an exception to what I will say. However, I'm keeping this video simple for those who are new to building codes. Step 1. First, I begin by asking, what's the primary and accessory occupancy of the building in its new form? In this example, a small portion of the building on the first floor will be an A2 occupancy per Chapter 3 of the IBC or CBC. The remainder of the first story is a B for business occupancy, again, per Chapter 3. And if you need a refresher on occupancies and what they are, I'll leave a link here in the video for you to refresh and then come back to this step. Go through this exercise if you have a multi-story building and identify all the occupancies per Chapter 3 per floor. If you have a single occupancy building, then your code analysis to determine the building size will get a little easier. When there is more than one occupancy group in a building, the building is described as a mixed occupancy, and this requires additional steps for every step that we'll go through. The mixed occupancy will be either separated or non-separated and is used to determine the allowable building size. Before we discuss what these terms separated and non-separated mean, let's take a step back. Not all additional uses within a building cause the building to be classified as a mixed occupancy. If you have multiple occupancies, those other occupancies might fall under the category of an accessory occupancy or even an incidental use. Those two phrases have very different meanings. Accessory occupancies are ancillary to the main occupancy in which they are located. Incidental uses are ancillary functions that are associated with an occupancy that poses a greater level of risk to that occupancy. Incidental uses will need greater fire separation in most cases. The aggregate areas of both either an aggregate accessory or an incidental use must be limited to 10% for you to even call it an aggregate or an incidental use of that building area. In our example here, let's clarify. We have a greater than 10% A2 occupancy because 10% of 19,000 square feet is 1,900, and the A2 is currently 5,000 square feet. So we've gone over the 10%. So we can't say that A2 is an accessory occupancy. This means that we can't classify A2 as an accessory or even an incidental use. Therefore, we're going to call it a mixed occupancy building, which is going to then require either a separated or a non-separated approach for fire and life safety. And we'll talk about this in a later portion of this video. So let's summarize. Buildings and spaces are classified into occupancy groups based on their uses per Chapter 3. These groups are further subdivided to provide more specific requirements for the different types of uses within that same occupancy, and accessory occupancies and incidental uses may also be present. Next item in the checklist, Step 2, does the building classify as a high-rise? In IBC CBC Chapter 4, it defines a high-rise building as one that has floors used for human occupancy that's located greater than 75 feet above the lowest floor level having building access. I'll repeat that again. Chapter 4 defines a high-rise as a building that has floors used for human occupancy located more than 75 feet above the lowest floor level having building access. Where any part of a building meets this requirement, all areas of that building are considered to be part of the high-rise and must meet code. Some occupancies, such as open parking structures, are not required to meet the requirements for a high-rise building, regardless of their height. Remember, the height as measured for a high-rise classification is not the same as building height. The lowest floor level is a parking garage and does not have human occupancy in our example. Therefore, we can ignore that 15-foot basement and instead focus on measuring the height of the building from level 1. If we add 12 feet per level, we get a total building height of 84 feet, which is over the 75-foot limit. This means that the building is classified as a high-rise and will need to conform to life safety regulations for a high-rise as discussed in IBC or CBC Chapter 4. That will have a much different fire and life safety requirement than a non-high-rise building. Remember, everything is here for safety, and buildings that pose a greater hazard, these will have additional requirements. Think of the Twin Towers and how long it would have taken people from the highest floor to traverse all those stairs during the 9/11 attack. We design our buildings accordingly. Equipped with that information for starters, now we can move on to the next step in this checklist. Step 3, we can begin by asking ourselves, what's the actual building height of the proposed building? Before we were talking about the high-rise to classify it as a high-rise or a non-high-rise, but now we're looking to see if the proposed building height is allowed per code. To do this, the building height is the distance between the grade plane, which is essentially a reference plane representing the average level of the finished ground adjacent to that building, and the average height of the highest roof. That is, if you have towers, spires, and steeples, as well as rooftop structures that are not going to be used for habitation or storage, then these are not necessarily included in the building height. The allowable height of a building is a function of its occupancy group and the type of construction. Table 504.3 in the IBC or CBC provides the maximum height in feet above grade plane. Qualifying mezzanines and levels below grade plane, such as basements, underground levels, do not count towards the limitation on the maximum allowable number of stories. In this example, the actual building height from the ground plane is 84 feet. I already know the type of construction the building will be a Type 2A. Per the CBC 2022, Chapter 5, Table 504.3, and if we look at under Type 2A, let's say we're using a sprinklered building without an area increase, and we'll talk more about area increase later. A B occupancy says that we can build up to 85 feet in height, while an A2 occupancy says we can build up to 85 feet as well. Therefore, in terms of height, our building is fine for now at this stage of the analysis. The next step, step 4, is do we have an attic or a basement, and do these count as part of the number of stories in the building? Per the IBC or CBC, an attic is not a story, so it cannot be a story above grade plane. An attic is simply the space between the ceiling beams of the topmost story and the roof rafters. The concealed space may extend from immediately below the roof sheathing to the ceiling membrane below. An attic is not a story, it's not an occupiable space or an exit access. What about a basement? Per IBC CBC Chapter 2, the definition of a basement says, a story that is not a story above grade plane. So a basement is typically below a grade plane. However, it might be considered a story if it meets certain conditions. A basement could be counted as a story in a building if its height is more than 50% above the average finished ground level around it. A basement could also be counted as a story if it is used for human occupancy. Consult with a local building official for the most accurate application for your project. In our example, we have a basement that is completely below the grade plane and is not occupied, as you can see, except it is going to be used for storage, mechanical, and electrical spaces in addition to a parking garage. We also, in this building, don't have an attic. So knowing this, we can figure out that the number of stories are going to be simply whatever we have minus a basement, essentially. Step 5. The next step in this checklist is, what are the number of stories allowed for the building? To answer this, we'll need additional information, such as where's the grade plane? We already figured out the attic and basement will not count in this example. Let's step back and define first what is a story. The term story refers to the portion of the building between the upper surface of one floor and the upper surface of the floor or roof above. We can measure a story from slab to slab, or from finished floor to finished floor, or from one floor to another. Where do we start counting the stories from? A story above grade plane is a story for which the finished floor surface is entirely above grade plane, or a story for which the finished floor surface of the next floor above is greater than 6 feet above the grade plane, or, and this is the last or, the finished floor surface of the next floor above is more than 12 feet above ground level at any point. The grade plane is used to determine the building height, stories, as well as to classify a level as a basement or story above grade plane. The grade plane is the average finished ground level adjoining the building at the exterior walls. The original elevation of the site is not really relevant in determining grade plane if it has been altered to create the final form of the site. Grade plane is a plane at a single elevation that's calculated by taking the average of the elevations determined for each side of the building. The average elevation of each side of the building is based on the lowest points within 6 feet and on the same lot as the building. Knowing where the stories start at the ground level establishes the first critical constraint. And once we have that information, then we can ask ourselves, how many stories? In a mixed-use occupancy building like this example, the number of stories is typically determined by the most restrictive occupancy classification. In this case, we have a B and an A2 mixed occupancy. Building codes will often categorize occupancies into groups based on their uses. The occupancy group with the stricter requirements will dictate the building's design and construction requirements. In this example, per the CBC Table 504.4, Type 2A sprinklered without area increase, an A2 occupancy building can be 4 stories maximum. The B occupancy can be 6 stories maximum. Since 4 stories is more strict than 6 stories, our building can be 4 stories tall. Remember, this all goes back to the fact that our A2 occupancy is greater than 10% of that B occupancy. And for this reason, we had to classify the building as a mixed occupancy. And so now that we're equipped with this information, we can move on to the next step. The next item in the checklist. Are there mezzanines? And if so, do they meet the area requirement? A mezzanine is discussed in IBC or CBC Chapter 5, Sections 505.2. A mezzanine is defined as an intermediate level between the floor and ceiling of a single story. Such mezzanines shall not contribute to either the building area or the number of stories. The area of the mezzanine shall be included in determining, however, the fire area. So remember that. The clear height above and below the mezzanine floor construction shall be not less than 7 feet, is what the code says. In fully sprinklered buildings of Type 1 or Type 2 construction, the aggregate area of mezzanines may not exceed half the area of the space into which the mezzanine opens when a fire alarm system with a voice capability is provided. In other buildings, the aggregate area of the mezzanine may not exceed 1/3 of the room in which the mezzanine is located. A mezzanine is generally required to be open to the space in which it is located, although under certain conditions, an enclosed mezzanine is permitted. In all occupancies, a fully enclosed mezzanine is permitted if at least 2 means of egress are provided from the mezzanine, and one of those is an exit from the level containing the mezzanine, such as an exterior exit stairway. Mezzanines are not counted as a full story as long as they meet the area limitations and occupancy requirements of a mezzanine. If those limitations are exceeded, then a mezzanine may have to be counted as a separate story, so always check the code. In our example, the first floor is 19,000 square feet total. The mezzanine, which will be part of the first story, is an additional 8,000 square feet, and it's not fully enclosed. 8,000 square feet divided by 19,000 square feet gives us about 0.4. And since the mezzanine is less than half the area of the story below it, it qualifies as a mezzanine. We have the first story, then the mezzanine, then 3 more stories above the mezzanine. That means 4 total stories plus the mezzanine, which again is not counted towards the total stories. Since we figured out how to treat the mezzanine and the basement and already calculated the building height and stories, the next step in the checklist is to calculate the increase for frontage. The frontage increase is a means for buildings to receive an area factor increase based on frontage. To qualify for an area factor increase per 506.3.1, a building shall not have less than 25% of its perimeter on a public way or open space. Additionally, the public way or open space adjacent to the building perimeter shall have a minimum distance of 20 feet, measured at right angles from the building face to an interior lot line, a street, or exterior face of an adjacent building on the same property. Then, 506.3.3 provides a frontage increase factor, which can be used to increase the area of a building. If your building has a court, a yard, or an open area that is not part of your building area, then these will be treated a little differently. A court, for example, is any open, uncovered space that is unobstructed to the sky above and is enclosed on 3 or more sides by exterior building walls. Yards are any open space that is unobstructed from the ground to the sky, not defined as a court, meaning it's not enclosed on more than 2 sides and is located on the same lot as the building. That was for a yard. And then there's an areaway. Areaways are subsurface spaces that are adjacent to a building that is open at the top. These openings are used to provide access from the exterior to building services located below grade. When a court is being used as part of a means of egress, it has to meet the requirements for egress courts. What you need to know at this stage is simply this. The presence of yards may be used to justify unlimited area buildings, as well as frontage increases associated with allowable areas per story. The next step in the checklist. Will it be a single building, a single structure divided into multiple buildings, or more than one structure on the same lot? To meet the allowable area requirements, a single structure may be subdivided into more than one building using 1 or more firewalls. This is not the same as providing an occupancy separation within a mixed occupancy building, because an occupancy separation wall is only used to separate different functions within the same building. A firewall creates multiple structurally independent buildings that may or may not have the same occupancy groups. Alternatively, when 2 or more structures are located on the same lot and their aggregate area is within the limitation for a single building, the structures may be considered to be a single building for purposes of code compliance. Here's the bottom line. If you have a building area that is larger than what's allowed in the allowable area tables of the code, then just know that there are ways to increase your building area by separating the building via a firewall or having multiple buildings. These are not always cost-friendly, but these solutions are nonetheless solutions to explore. The next item in our checklist is to determine the area of each story and the building area for the proposed building. This depends on the type of construction, occupancy classification, whether it's going to be sprinklered or non-sprinklered, and the frontage increase, if any, that the building is on a public way or open space. Then you get a frontage increase or an increase in your allowable building area. The actual building area is compared to the allowable area to determine whether the size of the building is code compliant. Building area includes all the area within the surrounding exterior walls, exterior areas beneath floors that project beyond exterior walls, and exterior areas that are provided within a roof above. The area of courts, ventilation shafts, rooftop structures, open to sky roofs that are occupiable are not included in the building area. So those are good to remember. Areas of the building without surrounding walls, including occupiable areas on the roof that are beneath the projecting floor or roof above and are within the column line, are included in the building area. Area beyond the column line is not included. The total allowable building area of a sprinklered single occupancy building having more than 1 story above grade plane is equal to the allowable area per story multiplied by the number of stories above grade plane. The aggregate area of all stories, or the building area, may not exceed the total allowable building area. Some buildings are not limited in height or area. The area and height of a construction type 1A building for most occupancy groups is not limited. Open parking garages of type 1 and type 2 construction can also be of unlimited area. 1 and 2 story buildings of specific occupancies without automatic sprinklers throughout that are surrounded by public ways or yards not less than 60 feet in width are also permitted to be of unlimited area. In our example, we're not going to use the frontage increase calculation to increase our building area to keep things simple. We have a multi-occupancy building, and we've already established that. Let's say 19,000 square feet per story, and it's a 4-story building. That means our total building area is 76,000 square feet. We want to check if we can actually build to that allowable area. We'll jump over to the code table and check each of the occupancy allowable areas and pick the most stringent. In table 506.2, It provides the allowable area in square feet. The numbers listed in the table are per story, not for the entire building. Remember that. The numbers listed in the table are per story, not the entire building. We check A2 and B for type 2A, sprinklered multi-story building, and we get that A2 allows 46,500 square feet per story, and the B occupancy allows 112,500 square feet per story. The A2 occupancy is more stringent, so that's what we need to stick with. A 46,500 square foot per story building times 4 stories, we can build up to 186,000 square feet max allowable area for that building. However, we are way under that with our current design at 76,000 square feet provided, so we abide by the allowable area in this step. And finally, the last step in this checklist is to determine the size of our building. If more than one occupancy is present, we need to determine whether it needs to be separated or non-separated. If you're unfamiliar with occupancy groups, I'll leave a link to that video here to help you better understand this step of our code analysis. Each portion of a building is assigned a single occupancy classification, or an occupancy group, based on its use. A building that contains more than one occupancy group is a mixed occupancy building and may be designed using either a separated or a non-separated occupancies approach. A building is not considered a mixed occupancy when a single occupancy and qualifying accessory and incidental uses are present. That is really important to note, and I'm going to repeat it. A building is not considered mixed occupancy when only a single occupancy and a qualifying accessory and or incidental use are present. In a building using a non-separated occupancies approach, where you don't want to have any separation, the most stringent requirements related to fire safety systems, allowable height, and allowable area that are applicable to any of the occupancy groups present apply throughout the building. In this approach, rated occupancy separations are not required. In previous steps, notice how we compared B and A2 for area, height, and stories, and then selected the most restrictive. That was for a non-separated approach. In buildings that use a separated occupancies approach, however, the occupancy groups are separated by fire barriers or rated horizontal assemblies. This separation must meet minimum rating requirements based on the occupancy groups on either side of the separation. A building may have any number of separated occupancies. Code requirements for separated occupancies are applied based on the occupancy of that area. The allowable building height for any occupancy is independent of adjacent occupancies. The building area per story of each separated occupancy is required to be such that the sum of the ratios of the actual floor areas for each separated occupancy divided by the allowable area for each does not exceed the number 1. Separated occupancies can be provided in buildings that are otherwise using a non-separated occupancies approach. The place to begin for separations in mixed occupancies is IBC Table 508.4, which discusses the required separation of occupancies. The occupancy groups are listed on 2 sides of the table, along with a column for sprinklered versus non-sprinklered. Once you know which occupancies you have, then see where the 2 sides of the table intersect to get the number of hours. If we were using a separated occupancies approach for a B and an A2 mixed occupancy in a sprinklered building, then per this table, it means we need a 1-hour separation between a B and A2 occupancy wherever they occur in the building. If you see an N in the table, that means no separation is required between the 2 occupancies. If you see a number, then that's the number of hours of fire separation. If you see an NP in the table, it means not permitted, or those 2 occupancies are not allowed to be next to one another. This is an issue when you have 2 hazardous occupancies next to one another. We've covered a lot of material in this video at a very high level. For any terms that are fuzzy, I suggest writing them down and looking them up in Chapter 2 of the building codes and reading all those definitions. I hope this helps guide you in terms of giving you a 10,000-foot level overview of the approach of how to figure out the size of your building. Here are some questions to review what we've learned. Number 1, provide an example why the order matters for the steps presented in the code analysis. Number 2, describe mixed occupancy buildings and all the ways to classify mixed uses, including where in the code to find them. And number 3, pick 2 occupancies in any current or past project and list the fire rating in hours between the 2 occupancies if they were going to be separated. If you enjoyed this video, I'll leave a link here for 2 other videos that I think you'll enjoy.